Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
We are on the third chapter of Shemot, Exodus. I believe we did all of the Rashis in verse 5, which positions us at verse 6. The pagination for those of us in the Torah Chaim Chumash are on page Kaf Vav. And just to give us a little bit of momentum, I'll read the previous verse to give us, just to kind of remind us where we are. So verse 5 was, so now I'm just keep having to pause myself to let people in. Verse 5 was Vayomer al tikrav halom. Moshe was told, God said to Moshe, don't come halom, something like closer to here. Shal ne'alecha me'al raglecha, remove your shoe or take off your shoe from your foot. Ki hamakom, for the place, asher ata omed alav, upon which you stand. Admat kodesh hu, is a land, is earth of holiness. And we spent some time with the Rashi figuring out what shall means, and is it a one motion or a two motion act, and the grammar of Admat Kodesh Hu as opposed to Admat Kodesh He, unless there are severely important lingering concerns about that verse. Rebecca, does that rise to that level? Rebecca Shah.
So I wasn't able to attend last week, so I listened to the recording last night, so it's fresh in my mind.
Okay.
And I really enjoyed the discussion about Shal Na'alecha. And I just wanted to add that the term Neshel HaNachash in Hebrew means that outer layer of scales that a snake sheds. And I think that sheds some more light on the verb and how it's used and whether it's passive or more active, in that it's neither, sort of. It's in between. It's not completely passive, but it's not a pulling off kind of verb in that context.
Very nice. The verb, it's neshel hanachash?
Yeah. It's like the
thing just sloughed off. Very interesting.
The shedding of the slough. Right, that's the word. Yeah. Very
good. So that reinforces the line of thinking that we were looking at last week of this is a slipping off as opposed to an untying of a shoe. Good. Neshel hanachash. Thank you for teaching me that phrase. Okay, so let's move to verse 6. And as we have been discussing the last few weeks, we're going to be witnessing, even at our pace, a little bit of quiet from Rashi. And we've been discussing how, is this a nothing, or is this Rashi taking a step back as Moshe is being asked to do and just watching the scene happen rather than commenting on every single word, which he sometimes does. Over the next few verses, he's going to say very few things. Renee, would you please read verse 6, Vayomer.
Vayomer Anochi Elohei Avicha, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Vayaster Moshe Panav, Ki Yarei Ma'abit El Elohim.
Okay.
So he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at or gaze at toward God.
Good. So it's a verse where the vocabulary is pretty easy, so that we can jump over the basics of what the words mean. There are no hard roots to deal with, and we can focus more on what we're supposed to be imagining in our mind with the phrase Vayaster Moshe Panav. Right? What is it? In what way did Moses soter, hide, put aside his face? And we can also linger on the interesting structure of the phrase Mehabit El Elohim, right? Ki yarei, for he feared. Mem in biblical Hebrew means lots of different things. Remember, prepositions in biblical Hebrew are like stem cells. They're pluripotent. They mean lots of different things based on where they appear. So mem, which is the shortened of mean, can mean from, but it can also mean with respect to, and many other ideas built into it. So he was afraid he was afraid to meh, and then habit is from the verb lihabit, to stare, but it's sort of like a gerund. He was afraid from staring at El Elohim, God, to God, right? Which presages the scene we're going to have in Parshat Ki Tisa, when he actually requests to look directly at God's face, and God says no. Here, in Moshe's first encounter, he has an instinctual understanding that he ought not stare. Later, once he's developed a chummy relationship with God, Moshe says, please let me stare. So those are two kind of inflection points in the verse, and then I'm curious for people's thoughts on that and or other questions. So I see Rick, and I see Andrew, and I see Matt. Rick, and I see Joel.
Hi. So why the verb lehabit instead of just like lirot or other ways to see? In verse 4 we had God vayaring, yes, and Moses up in verse 3, but here it changes to staring. So that would be a question. So that's
Good.
all.
So not just the form of mehabit, but why that shoresh, right? There are a lot of ways of saying, look at why do we have habit here? Good. I think Andrew's hand was next.
I was curious about the timing of the hiding of the face. Is there something about immediately learning that this is God, father of the forefathers, that instills the fear? Because the fear could have been registered in the past pasuk or two. It could have, after whoever this person was saying, do not come closer, he could have hid his face. So I'm curious if there's some sort of cause and effect in terms of God revealing who he is and the hiding immediately thereafter.
Good. And your question maybe asks us also to look at what the impact of the double vayomer is in verse 5 and verse 6 without an interruption. You know how, like in English writing, when you start a next paragraph in the middle of a quotation mark, you don't end the quotation mark at the end of the previous paragraph, but you start the quotation mark again in the second paragraph. So God is still speaking. There has not been a response by Moshe. God said, don't come closer. God said, take off your shoes. God told him that the land is holy. Verse 5 could have just been Anochi Elohei Avicha in the middle of the quotation marks. God's still speaking. We have another Vayomer and then a response from Moshe. So you're wondering, I don't have an easy resolution for you, which part of what God said to Moshe induces the hiding of the face? Interesting question. Okay. I think that Matt was next.
Unmute. Hi. So just the questions. Elohei, Yomer Anochi Elohei. So that sounds plural to me. Avicha, your father. Is that one father or is that plural fathers?
Good. Okay. I'm going to focus on the second one first. I forgot which commentary on it. I think Chizkuni says that the first of these phrases, Elohei Avicha, rather than read it as the God of your ancestors, because it's singular, this is God obliquely telling Moshe that your father, Moshe, is dead. Because Chizkuni says that God only refers to God's self as being the God of a parent, if that parent is a deceased tzaddik as opposed to a living tzaddik. Because why else is the phrase Elohei Avicha there, right? The reason why Elohei is plural, you're right, is because in referring to God, Elohim is always in the plural form, right? And we can go back into the etymology and to the pre-theology of biblical Israel as to why the plural form of God is present. But just grammatically speaking, Elohim is always in the plural. So whenever Elohim is declined in the Bible, it's declined as a plural noun, even if it's denoting a singular God. Yeah. But the Avicha is very interesting. Go ahead, Matt.
And then a follow up, which is sort of related. At the end of the sentence is Lehabit El Ha Elohim.
Yeah.
Which we don't, because I think we read it, we said Elohim, or the second we were talking about it, we said El Elohim, but it's really El Ha Elohim.
Yeah, and we've found that a few times where occasionally, as if God is not definite enough, God gets an article, a the, right?
Well, I guess in this case it means the one who is talking to you.
Maybe, yeah.
You're not speaking.
Elohim nisa et Abraham, right? The divine God tried Abraham. I've never read good explanation as to when the ha is there and when the ha is not there. So let's let those questions lay in front of us. Elon and Joel, and then yes, go ahead, Matt.
Sorry, I think in this case, because if we speak El Elohim, that would be like you look up to the sky and you're speaking to God, in a very broad, diffuse way. And here, a manifestation of God is actually talking to you. So you're looking at a specific manifestation or incarnation or whatever it is. That's why the ha is there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if Onkelos is responding to the ha or just responding to the whole scene. At the end of Onkelos' translation, he renders are dachil, ki are, he was afraid, mile istakala, from looking at, he renders habit as from the verb lehistakel, betseit yekara d'Adonai, at the brilliant glory of God, as opposed to just God. So there's something going on for Onkelos that is either he's dealing with the ha, or he's breaking it down, as some of the other commentators on the page say, that it's not that this was not like Yirat Elohim, awe of God, which we normally understand in the tradition to be the source of your obedience, but literal fear at the emanation of God, and therefore he didn't want to look directly at it. Is that related to the ha? Not clear, but it's interesting that Onkelos does not just translate it word for word. Okay, I think so many hands up. Wonderful. Joel, you're next. No, Elon was next. Elon and then Joel. Sorry.
Yeah, this is a question that not only applies to this line, but just in general. Is there a significance or any meaning when, instead of just saying the God of your forefathers, they actually list the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And obviously this occurs in the Torah, but also in liturgy as well, or is it just a random event?
Yeah, we have to do a kind of a comprehensive look to answer that fully. In liturgy, it's common, right? In the Amidah, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, and if you add the Imaot, you add the four as well. What's interesting here is that there's, in Moshe's life story, we don't yet have a great linkage to him and the story of Breshit, right? We have him growing up in the palace. We have him recognizing that the people out there who are being oppressed are him too. We can fantasize about what story he's been told. Like, to what extent is Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov his forefathers? He considers them to be his forefathers. What does that phrase mean to Moshe, right? Particularly because of his dual identity. So the fact that we've got four Elohei's in the verse, Elohei Avicha, the God of your father, is that a capital F father, meaning the God of your ancestor, and then the specifics, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. To Moshe's ear, what does that sound like? What is it invoking for Moshe? And the Midrash plays with that, but the Pshat doesn't help us. The Pshat doesn't have us seeing Moshe sitting around the campfire hearing these stories from his parents, because his parents were not the ones who had those stories anyway, right? His childhood stories were Pharaoh stories, not Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov stories.
He's not saying Abotecha.
He's not saying Abotecha, right? It's Avicha, which is, I think, the anchor or the engine for Chizkuni's comment that this has to do with your individual father. Right?
Mm-hmm.
This may set our record for number of hands up at any given point in a class. I think, Joel, you're next.
Aren't we missing an et here? I mean, to my ear, it sounds like Vayaster Moshe et panav. I mean, it just doesn't ring right. I don't know if there's a grammatical reason for that.
Good question. Yes, you would think that Vayaster is a transitive verb, and it should. We have to think panav as a direct object, and the et is not there. L'chora, at first glance, I do not have an answer. However, maybe Onkelos helps us here because Onkelos turns the verb into a intransitive verb, giving a preposition as opposed to a direct object. He also changes the verb. So if you look at Onkelos, going back to the beginning of the verse, Va'amar, he said, Ana Elaha da'avuch, I am the God of your father. Elaha da'Abraham, the father of Abraham. The God of Abraham. Elaha di'Yitzchak, the God of Isaac. Ve'elaha di'Yaakov. Uch ve'shinun Moshe la'apuhi. He kind of, the Hebrew of lichbosh means to conquer, right? Kibush, like kibush ha'aretz, or the conquering the land. Here it's more like a pushing down, a pushing down the head so that there is an averting of his eyes. And by rendering the verse that way, and by bringing in the lamed, it's suggesting that either in the Aramaic or maybe Onkelos is also talking about the Hebrew, this is a verb that requires a preposition, an intransitive verb, as opposed to a transitive verb. Marshall, do you have your Onkelos volume in front of you? And can you unmute so we can hear you?
Yes, okay. And this is on verse...
on verse 6.
Yeah, and he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look toward the glory of the Lord.
So so your translation translates Onkelos' translation as simply hid?
Yes.
That's it, and that's a translation of the Onkelos, not of the Torah?
Of the Onkelos.
Interesting. So then I'm as confused as you were, Joel, as to why the why the hid in Aramaic gets the indirect object of a preposition and not a direct object, and the absence of an et, I'm not sure. Vered, I saw your hand was up before. Do you have anything to respond to this particular question?
Actually, I wanted to talk about from Mehabit. From that.
Okay.
That
you're permitted.
Am I permitted? Okay. So this is habit is the infinitive of this verb. The verb means to gaze or to look at something, but there is a difference if I'm looking, through the window and I see the rain coming versus, gazing on it and dreaming a little bit and seeing how it affects the trees or whatever. So there is a verb in Hifil, habit, which is what we call in grammar a naked infinitive. The shoresh is nun bet tet. Thus we have a dagesh in the bet. And then if it's a naked, what we call infinitive, you can put bachlams in front of it. Lehabit, to look, behabit, while looking, and mehabit means from looking, So depends. Habit, the hey is part of the infinitive. That's what I wanted to say. It's not any other hey.
Thank you for that. I did not know that term, the naked infinitive. So it's essentially the infinitive without the lamed.
It's the infinitive without 4 letters called bachlam, like lishmor. So shmor will be the naked infinitive, and then you put lishmor, bishmor, kishmor. Can put those 4 letters.
Got it.
And there is a difference, like in English, either you gaze at something out of astonishment or the wow, look at this, something different, this fire that is not consuming is look versus simple to look at this page or something. So there's a difference.
So thank you for that. Going back one step to Joel's question, I want to show you something interesting in the Aramaic here. So if we look at Onkelos, turns lahabit turns vayaster into uch veshinun, right? So it's related to the Aramaic root kaf beit shin, which begins here. And if you see the Aramaic root, the way Jastro's dictionary works is that first he gives you the Hebrew root up here, kavash, biblical Hebrew, and then the Aramaic root, kivash, down here, and they're not always the same meaning. And you'll see that this root has many different meanings. The first meaning is to press or to grade or to make a path, like the ramp up to the the altar was called the kevesh. Okay? Then you've got also number 2, to press on, to put on the head, similar to the chavash, which is the proper root to say in Hebrew when you're wearing a hat, you're not loveshing a kova, you're choveshing a kova. And Jastrow said that's related to kavash here. To bind, to fillet, to inlay. That's the 3rd meaning. The 4th meaning is to tread upon, to stamp out, to suppress and oppress is the 5th meaning. To withhold and to detain is the 6th meaning. To hide. The 7th of the 7 meanings of the Aramaic root kaf bet shin is to hide specifically the face or to close the eyes. And look at that. We call it a Jastrow jackpot, a very rare Jastrow jackpot in Uncliffe. This was a great moment in yeshiva study when you would look up a word in Jastrow, and the example that Jastrow would give to tell you what it meant was the exact place in the Talmud or the Midrash you're looking at. Look what he says. Targum, that's Uncliffe, Exodus chapter 3, verse 6. So Jastrow was looking at this exact line of Uncliffe translation as an example for how to understand what kevesh means, which means to hide. Doesn't answer why it's an indirect object, for me at least. So your question, Joel, still stands. Okay. So many hands up. Let's go Marshall, and then Norm, and then Joanna, and then we'll continue on the rest of the list.
Well, we know the Torah was present at creation because that's how the world was created. So I suspect that Moses got an advanced copy of it. But he was playing his cards very close to his chest because Vayaster Moshe Panav. Normally we have Hastarat Panim, God hides his face. Now Moses is hiding his face. And so the question is, why is it we have Moses hiding his face? And Alter sort of gives us an interesting insight here where he talks about God's relationship to Abraham, where they spoke Panim el Panim. But Moses, reading ahead in the text, said, he said to God, Harini na et kvodecha. In fact, show me your honor. And the God says, nope, lo yirani ha'adam b'chai. No person shall see me and shall live. So there's really a difference. And Moses was even afraid to look at the fire, which was not a direct presentation, was not God itself, but he was even afraid to look at that fire.
Yeah, I love that reference that Alter says to Panim al Panim, because the Torah's memory of Moshe's relationship with God is Panim al Panim. But at each moment that you could imagine that they would be Panim al Panim, the Torah explicitly says that it didn't happen, right? Mm-hmm. First, Moshe here being the one who conceals, and then later on, when Moshe asks for the exposure and God says, no, you can only look me'achorai, right, at my backside. But when Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is remembering Moshe's relationship with God, all of a sudden it's Panim al Panim. Great. I don't even remember who I said next. Norm.
I wanted to talk about the importance of the Vayera. God tells Moshe, take off your shoes, and he doesn't simply continue speaking and identifying himself. Moshe maybe says, okay, maybe just does it. He takes off his shoes. There's an intervening moment or 3, and then God proceeds to identify himself in this very classic way.
Say that again. I'm not sure. I know there's a lot there, but I'm not sure I'm following the causation you're suggesting. Say it one more time.
I'm saying that the Vayomer being put there means it wasn't. He couldn't simply have had one quote for the whole thing, because they're 2 separate speeches by God with some period of time intervening, and maybe even a response by Moshe that the Torah doesn't record because it isn't consequential.
Got it. The second Vayomer kind of implies an ellipsis from the end of the previous verse, and that Moshe responded to what God asked God to do. Nice. Thank you, Norm. Joanna.
A couple of things. So the first thing I was thinking about, similar to the point that was made earlier about the liturgy, but like being in that moment in the liturgy, because I believe while even like a few verses later and elsewhere, we have that triad of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Remember that phrasing that we have in the Amidah, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. I believe this is the first time we see it. So I'm wondering now, like, when we're davening, are we supposed to be back at the burning bush? And then also on this whole thing of lehabit and what it is to look or to gaze upon God, I was thinking about two other things in Tanakh. When just a few parshiot on, we know that Bnei Yisrael also have a difficult time in their first encounter with God. So there's something about gazing or looking at God on your first encounter that is just an incredibly overpowering experience. And then before we get to Deuteronomy, I was thinking about, I forget exactly where in Bamidbar it is, where Miriam and Aharon kind of speak up against Moses, and God answers back to them and says, basically don't speak that way about Moses because he's the only one that I allow to look upon me. And the phrase there is Tmunat Adonai. So this whole thing of looking at God and what does it mean to look at God versus to look at, why not just say that he looks at God? So there is something which is making me wonder about that mem here, mehabit. Why mehabit and not lehabit? There's something about how even Moses gazes upon God and what aspects of God Moses is able to see when he does so.
Good. I'm so taken by what you said, Joanna, particularly this microcosm. Moshe's initial encounter with God is a microcosm for the Israelites' initial encounter with God, and maybe all of our initial encounters with God is awkward and not knowing where to put your eyes, and not even being able to be sure what you're seeing, and it's not going smoothly. And so, thank you for both of those comments. Okay. We've got, I think now, Diane, Larry, Barry, Tova, and then Matt, as long as your hand is up again and not for the previous time, I don't remember.
So I'm hung up on God's speaking, who's God speaking to, or when God speaks, and I quickly went back to see what he says when he speaks to different characters. I'm sure someone's written a dissertation on this. God speaks to Adam, and he speaks to Noah, he speaks to Abraham, and he doesn't introduce himself at all. He just says what he's going to say. He doesn't say, I'm God. He doesn't establish his credentials. I don't think he ever speaks to Isaac, to Yitzchak. I may be wrong. But when he speaks to Yaakov, that's the first time I saw that he actually says that I'm the God of your father. He's established his credentials. And now here he's establishing his credentials. Why does God feel the need to establish to Moses who he is? It's God. He's speaking from the bush. Why does he have to give like an ambassador presenting credentials to a court? Why does he have to establish who he is? And then going further forward, I haven't looked at it. I'm wondering how many other times God actually does that with the Nevi'im, with the prophets, when he introduces himself, as opposed to just saying, I'm God. But to Joanna's point, just the last thing, here it's God saying, I'm the God of your father and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not us saying, you are the God of our fathers. So it's actually a turn. It's very different than our trying to identify who this God is, as opposed to God saying who he is to Moses.
It's a turn on a turn if you think about it, because the way the liturgy plays this, when we say in the Amidah, classically, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, we're less identifying God, we're identifying us. Since it talk about credential establishment, since we, God, are the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and you loved them and you paid attention to them, it's on their merit that we come before you in penitence. So, right? So the Chazal in davening turned presenting God's papers to Moshe into our presenting our papers to God as descendants of the very people that God linked God's self to in this presentation to Moshe. It's really it's an interesting switch.
And we do this in the Pasuk in the Zimmer too, if you think about it, in the Leomi Adam, the Ma'anachnu prayer, because that... Yeah, so who are we? We don't know, but we know who we are because we know who our ancestors were, and it's for that fact that we're going to praise you.
Yeah, good. We might be a nothing, but our ancestors weren't, right? Okay, Tova, Barry, Matt.
Well, neatly picking up on the Father or the God of, what struck me with it is I feel like there's a connection to the High Elohim, because we are given or reminded of that God has been known within this family, if you will, through the individual leaders, through God's relation with that individual leader. And that's how God has been known for these generations. And it just strikes me that with this High Elohim, God has suddenly been expanded. It's a more expansive vision of God, which is also where we're going in terms of it's going to be God relating to a people, God that will increasingly by that people be regarded not just as the God of that people, but the God of everything. Mm. So there's this transformation that we're seeing with that introduction and then the High Elohim.
Nice. That also would be interesting to kind of follow and research whether or not the context of the Ha Elohim is suggesting a grander, more worldly, universal God as opposed to the provincial God. I'm not sure that bears out, but all the time. But I like your read of it here. By the way, before we call him Barry, isn't it interesting that this is close to the most amount of time we've spent on a verse itself before even looking at commentary, and Rashi doesn't say anything on this verse. Rashi like, oh yeah, this verse makes sense. I have no questions, no comments. I'm sleeping at the wheel. Barry.
Just on the last comment you made, Rabbi, I think we really don't want to move forward. After this, the whole story starts. So we just want to stay where we are and not move forward. But okay, until verse 6, it's an experience. Moshe's had this experience with the bush and a voice talking to him. Only in verse 6 it is God saying, I am God. It's God is introducing God's self to Moshe. And so now I think the Ha is Moshe is separating himself from what he's looking at.
Say that again.
Until now, Moshe's experience has been he sees a bush, he sees this flame, he hears a voice. Okay, this is Moshe's curiosity. He's observing this. The gazing, this word for gazing, all of a sudden, that this is like it's almost like an intimate looking. He can't do this, and the he's separating himself from this Elohim. He has to pull back from this. He can no longer be curious about it. He has to step back from it.
So we have a lot of possible reads kind of open right now as to what that Ha as a direct object is doing in that place. Thank you, Barry. Joanna and Matt, are your hands up from now or from before?
Sorry, from before.
Okay, Matt?
Yeah, just going back to the et. I don't really have an answer, but I'm theorizing. I think Marshall mentioned the phrase Seter Panav. So I think maybe it's not really a case of an indirect object, but rather an idiomatic usage of Seter. So hidden face is Seter Panav, and according to my dictionary, there's also something Beseter Libo, like in the depths of one's soul. And so it could be, of course, that we've learned to use Seter Panav without the et because that's the way it is in this pasuk. But right. So I'm wondering if it's either more or less than a typical verb usage. It's more idiomatic, hiddenness, hidingness.
We're way down a rabbit hole here, and I love this rabbit hole. Right, we're really focusing on we're lingering on the absence of an et. Right.
I remember I sent you something about where in the Talmud it says you shouldn't drash the et or the absence of an et.
Well, but Rabbi Akiva said you should.
Yeah.
Yeah, in smichut, right, when you're putting two nouns together, and even if the first noun is a verbal noun, like a gerund, hastarat panim,
right?
Never be hastarat et panim.
No.
I can't explain why in words, but the untranslated direct object would fall out there. In the verbal form, though, normally you would, unless you're right. You're talking about almost like a 2-word verb where the noun is part of that particular phrasing,
right?
And for reasons that we don't understand, it doesn't get it. And again, I wonder if Onkelos' l there is not that he's telling us that, but it's just illustrative of the fact that when he went from that Hebrew to the Aramaic, he didn't do yat, right? And he didn't put in a yat, which is the Aramaic et. And the fact that that the verb he chose is pulls a lamed as a preposition might suggest something about how this verb and noun form is constructed. Yeah. It's also the case, by the way, that there are probably many more places than we are actually mentioning it, where an et is not there when it could be. Like we're focusing on this.
Right.
I don't think that the et is present every single time in a verb that in English would require. We would think of it as a transitive direct object verb, and we're lingering on this now, which is great. But I'm not sure it's as much of an absence as we're making it out to be. Rick, first of all, I loved your comment, Rick, that there's no time for the et because Moshe responded so obediently. Vayaster, his face has already been moved away. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you. So the Elohei Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, we did just hear that in verse 24, where we had the 4 different ways that God is going to remember what he promised to do, saving us and all that, the Shema, Yizkor, the Yar, and Vayeda. So the verbs are coming up again. Anyway, there you had et Abraham, et Yitzchak, and et Yaakov. So there were lots of ets there. But we just had that, and the verbs are coming again. So that's all.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have exhausted the questions on the verse, and that opens us up to go to the next verse. So if anyone against that, look at verse 7. Whom have we not heard from today who can read? Carol, I know you've been on and off the Zoom. If you're still with us, do you want to read verse 7?
Yeah, I've been having audio issues. Can you hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Good. Thank you. Vayomer Adonai Ra'o Ra'iti et, I'm assuming that's Oni.
Correct.
Instead of Ani, Oni Ami, Asher b'Mitzrayim, Ve'et Sa'akatam Shamati, Mipnei Nogsav, Ki Yadati et Machovav.
Good. So let's see if we can break that down.
Okay, God said, I surely saw.
Good.
The suffering or I guess the burden of my people that are
oni is the same as lechem oni in the Haggadah, right? The
bread of affliction.
Affliction, right?
The affliction of my people that are in Egypt, and their cries, they're calling out. I heard. As a result of, or in the face of Nog Sav, I don't know. I don't know what that is. Nog Sav.
The Nogais is one of their oppressors, one of their taskmasters.
Okay, from the taskmasters, because of I knew their. I'm assuming that's pain. I see Koav in there. I just from their pain.
Good. Okay. So we have a little bit of a rhythm to the verse in Mipnei Nogsav Kiadati et Machovav. That same ending makes it a little bit lyrical. I love how you translated the Ra'o Ra'iti. This is the occasional doubling of a verb that suggests a surely or a verily. And we can ask the question what the purpose of the intensive is here, right? V'haya'im shamoa tishma'u, if you verily listen to my commandments. So what in the verse is asking is pushing God to say it not only as ra'iti but ra'o ra'iti. And we've got this question of nogsav, which is an interesting noun. And once again, we're going to be thinking about what it means for God to say yadati. What does it mean for God to say I know or I knew? And machovav is interesting now, right? They're pain, right? They're ke'evim. So let's see who has questions or comments, either comments on some of the questions that were just raised or separate questions before we look at what Rashi says on this verse. Because Rashi, or I'll say pseudo Rashi, because it's one of these Rashi comments where we're not exactly sure it's Rashi based on comparison with the first printing of Rashi, but there is Rashi attributed material on this verse. Larry,
can I ask a quick question while I'm unmuted?
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the mem in front of machovav.
Yes. Why is it machov? Why is it machov as opposed to ke'ev?
Right. Is it the same thing like Vera had said before?
I think
this isn't a verb.
Right. I would love to hear Vera's answer on it. There are Hebrew forms where, I'm trying to think of a one that's more common, where in the noun, a mem has been brought in to help create the word. That's not part of the shoresh. So, you know how in a pa'al verb, in a PL verb, that daber becomes midaber in the present tense. I need midaber, so that mem gets added in to help construct the verb. It also happens in certain nounal forms. So ke'ev might be the proper word in modern Hebrew, and machov, I'd be interested to hear Vered, is machov even a word in modern Hebrew? I've never heard of it. Vered, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, machov, there is like we have a theory about verbs, we have a theory about nouns, and there is a form that you take roots and you can put a mem before of it, and this is a noun. Machov is a noun, it's not a verb. It comes from a verb, but it's not a verb. So there's all kind of way to form nouns, and this is how it is. Machov. We think about
like a pump, right? Is like lishov is to pump, but the pump is a mashav, right? Or
mashov, which is exactly the same pattern. The vowels have to match the sound. It's phonetic. So mashov, machov is the same form. It's a noun, not a verb here. Yeah. Machovav is in plural. Machovim, and then his or theirs is machovav.
Yeah, great. Sometimes you see that, Carol, when you see modern Hebrew trying to extract modern meanings from ancient roots, like machshev. A computer is a machshev, right? So it has to do with the notion of lechashev, to compute, to think, to ideate. But in the constructing of a modern noun, this is not a modern noun, but in the constructing of a modern noun, often a mem is added in front of it. And I know there's a more precise way of describing that, but it's a biblical process as well. Larry, Diane, and Rebecca?
Okay, so this is a question about the tense of these verbs. They're all in past tense, which seems a little odd since the suffering is continuing, and I'm just wondering why God says I saw their suffering, but not I am seeing their suffering, since the suffering is continuing.
Yeah. It's a good question, both klal and prat, right? The prat question is why in this scene is God. Klal prat means general and specific. In this scene is all of God's presentation before Moshe seeming to be in a past or a perfect tense, as if what God is describing, God's having seen or God's having heard, God is no longer seeing and hearing, right? That's the notion of a perfect verb, is that the action is over. And then greater than that, right? And we've discussed this many times as we resolved it. How can we how do we graph on our grammatical understanding of Hebrew past tense and Hebrew perfect tense and Hebrew present tense onto our English understandings of it, and they don't exactly match, right? So there are plenty of places in the Torah where we would expect a present tense verb where we get some version of this. So it's still worth asking why here, and it's also a larger inquiry because they just don't match up 100%. So if anyone has any thoughts about that, I'd love to hear it. While we're waiting for that, Rebecca?
Yeah, so I wanted to say two things. First, to go back to machov, I think at least in the context of modern Hebrew, machov would be the thing that is causing the pain. So it would be like the wound that causes the ke'ev more than the actual ke'ev, I think, in my mind. My sort of question was about the ra'o ra'iti. Is that like saying, indeed, I did see? So he's sort of answering the question that is not being asked as, why is this happening? Why haven't you done something yet? Is that kind of how it's usually used?
In halachic and Talmudic language, we have this notion of a hava amina, the thing I might have said, and therefore, since there's a supposition you might have thought I would have, I'm going to reinforce to you that I didn't have that supposition, right? So it's possible that the doubling is to disabuse either this person in the scene or the reader of an idea that the speaker is definitely not having, right? You thought I didn't see it? Oh, I did see it. Possible. I love the way Everett Fox translates these doubling verbs. He doubles it in English in a very poetic way. Now, God said, I have seen, comma, yes, comma, seen the affliction of my people that's in Egypt. It's forced, but it's lovely because it turns the doubling of the verb in Hebrew into a doubling in English that makes sense. I've seen, yes, seen. Sometimes when it's a command form, we couldn't understand it that way because when God says Vaya'im Shemot Tishma'u, there's no supposition that needs to be disabused of. There's just an intensifying. But when it's being used by the speaker, we can wonder as to whether or not God is just trying to end the questioning as to whether or not God saw something. Before I see Marshall and Larry and Diane, I'm fascinated. I have no idea what's going on here. I'm fascinated that Onkelos is translating these active verbs into passive verbs. If you look at the Onkelos, if you have it, the Amar, and he said, by the way, it's the third verse in a row that begins with God saying, with the word Vayomer, but with different trup, Vayomer Tipcha, Vayomer Rebi'i, and now Vayomer Adonai, Amunach Katon. So in the Onkelos, Amar Adonai, God said, Migla Gli Kadamai. Onkelos retains the doubling of two verbs, but he turns it from I saw to it was certainly revealed before me. So interesting. There's an Aramaic word for to see, and he does it at the end of the verse also. So at the end of the verse, Ki adati et mach ovav, right? The Hebrew has switched from the root lirot, to see, to the root leida, to know. And Onkelos, again, renders it passive and renders it into this glei kadamai. Are glei kadamai, it has been revealed before me, yat kebehun, their pain. There's something there. I don't know what it is, but there's something there. If Marshall, if your book shed any light to it, I'd be interested to know, because it's not an obligatory way of dealing with those words. Marshall and then Larry, Diane.
Yeah. So the translation I have here is, then the Lord said, it has been revealed before me the servitude of my people, which are in Egypt, and their cry because of their taskmasters has been heard before me, for their pains have been revealed before me. Again, all in a passive. And then the next sentence, the translation here is, I will reveal myself to rescue them. We don't have that in the Hebrew itself, but we have it. Maybe we have it in the Onkelos.
Right. So right, you picked up on a third one. So even the shamati in our verse gets rendered in Aramaic as shemia kadamai. It was heard before me. So I don't know. I don't know if this represents like a theology of Onkelos' time or Onkelos' generation that would rather imagine something kind of coming before God as opposed to God as the active actor behind the verb. I'm not sure, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Marshall, but your hand was up, or also, was there something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, Robert Alter oftentimes is very conscious of the order of the words in a sentence, and his translation here sort of switches it, and it's sort of interesting to me. For he said, and the Lord said, Ra'o ra'iti, I indeed have seen the abuse of my people that is in Egypt, comma, and v'yetza'akatam mipnei noksav, and its outcry because of its taskmasters, period. And then he says, Shamati, I have heard, comma, and then he says, for I know its pain, ki yadati et machovav. So he has two, on the first two verbs, and then suddenly he comes to a conclusion. And why? Because I know its pain.
Yeah. So a lot of the translators are stymied by that because the key is hard to translate here. As key is also a pluripotent word, because, for, as a result of. If the key is a because, it doesn't make sense with the antecedent. I have heard their cries as a result of their taskmasters because I've known their pain. I've known their pain seems to be another thought, which makes us question what the key is. Everett Fox doesn't put a period, puts a semicolon. Now God said, it's written as Yud Hey Vav Hey, I have seen, comma, yes, seen the infliction of my people that is in Egypt, comma, their cry have I heard in the face of their slave drivers, semicolon, indeed, comma. He renders the key as indeed. Indeed, comma, I have known their sufferings. Because it does seem like another thought, not a causative idea. So the key is worth lingering on as well. Larry, Diane, and then Barry.
Oh, I thought Marshall was going to comment on this from Alter. The three verbs here, see, heard, and know. And if you recall, at the end of last chapter, we had the heard, remember, and know. And the know had no direct object. So he couldn't figure out what God knew, except we speculated God knew the suffering or knew the pain. But continuing along those lines, so God saw the action that was causing the problem, the taskmasters. He heard the reaction. He heard the crying. But what did he know? He knew the actual pain, which is not the reaction. It's the consequence of what was going on. So each verb is referring to a different aspect of the it's not an event, but of the condition of slavery.
Yeah.
To see the imposition of the slavery, to hear the complaining, the outcry against slavery, but what you really know are the horrible consequences of that enslavement, which without making a political point, I will say we can apply to a lot of conditions in life.
Yeah. Good.
To really know what the true consequences are, the pain.
Yeah, so you're almost reading ki yadati et machovav as a summative idea that emerges from the information in the first 2/3 of the sentence.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's why I like Alter's basically separating it. And I even like the way in which the translation in JPS is, yes, I am mindful.
Are you reading from the Eitz Chaim Chumash there?
No, actually, that's from the Sfaria, which I think is JPS.
Does someone who have the Eitz Chaim Chumash read this entire verse from it? I don't have it in front of me, because that is certainly the JPS translation. Anyone have it?
I have a JPS Tanakh in front of me.
Okay, let's hear that. Let's hear all the English in verse 7.
And the Lord continued, I have marked well the plight of my people in Egypt, and have heeded their outcry because of their taskmasters. Yes, I am mindful of their sufferings.
I like the ending of that translation. I don't love the beginning, but I like the ending. It's Alter and JPS and Ever Fox are dealing with all of the same questions. How are we supposed to understand those last three words? What's the purpose of the key? And it seems to be a comprehensive understanding, and that ends up being a good ramp into Rashi's comment on the verse, which we may or may not get to after Barry speaks. Go ahead, Barry.
Well, my sense of what I'm hearing is God's court has brought to God the cry and the pain, and God now, the ruler, the judge, now knows this.
The testimony has arrived where the testimony needs to go. Let's look at the Rashi quickly. If you're in our books, you see that it's in brackets with the footnote 84 saying B'tfus Rishon Leita. It's not in the initial printing, so we're not certain that this is originally Rashi. One of the reasons why it might not be Rashi, aside from the fact that it might not be Rashi, is that what he's going to say, he's already said a version of, and Rashi sometimes repeats himself, but doesn't often. Carol, with your blessing, I'm going to read it quickly just because we're running out of time. Ki adati et machovav, I have known their pain. Kimo, just like vayeda Elohim, like the last time we had a verb like this, and by the way, Rashi commented on it, that God knew. Kilomar, ki samti lev, I have placed my heart, lihitbonen, to look closely at, to investigate, veladaat, and to really know et machovav, their pain. Velo elamti eini, I did not hide my eyes. I did not do the exact thing that Moshe just did, was to hide his face. Velo etom ozni, and etom was like estom. I did not close my ears, mitza'akatam, from their crying. Several things happening in this Rashi. One, Rashi once again is dealing with the question of what does it mean to say that God knows? If you say that God knows X, you're suggesting it was possible for God not to know X. And if we're dealing with an omniscient God, then there's no not knowing that was possible. So what does it mean to say that God knows? So it doesn't mean that God knows as opposed to not knowing. God knows in the sense of God focuses on, God leans into, God does not do whatever God could do to interrupt that knowledge. It's different than a human saying, I didn't know X and I learned it and now I do. That doesn't apply to a divine being in our theology. It's a intimate connection to that will turn into action, right? And Rashi said something similar to that on Vayeda Elohim a few verses ago. The language there was Natan Alehem Lev. God had placed God's heart upon them. Velo He'elim, did not hide Einav, his eyes from them. Not that it was possible for God not to know, but in this knowing, God chooses to act, which is also something, going back to what Larry said, we can apply to lots of situations. There are a lot of times where we, human beings, yodea, and it does not lead to hitbonanut, looking closely, and it actually does lead to ha'alamat ayin, to choosing not to see. That's not the divine way of knowing. Marshall, your hand went up.
Just the extended JPS commentary on the word sa'akatam says the Hebrew word sa'ak is one of the most powerful words in the language. Pervaded by moral outrage and soul-stirring passion, it denotes the anguished cry of the oppressed, the agonized plea of the helpless victim.
Great. So when we meet next week, we went through that Rashi quickly, and if there are comments on it, I'd love to hear it. And then we'll push on to the next few verses where Rashi is going to be quiet for quite some time.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.